The laugh came first, not loud, not careless. It was the kind of laugh that carried certainty, the kind that said, "This is already over." The courtroom doors were still closing when Victor Hale leaned back in his chair and smiled slow and satisfied, as if he were watching a rerun he had already memorized. He did not look at the judge. He did not look at the clerk. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman standing alone at the plaintiff's table. No attorney beside her, no legal team, no quiet whisper of reassurance. Just her. Helen Carter stood perfectly still, hands folded around a thin manila folder, the paper edges worn soft from being handled too many times. Her coat was charcoal gray, clean but dated. The kind of coat someone bought years ago and kept because it still worked. Her hair, once carefully styled for boardrooms and investor dinners, was pulled back into a simple, low twist. No jewelry except a narrow watch with a scratched face. Her posture was straight, but her breathing betrayed her. Slow in, slower out. From the gallery, someone whispered, "She's really doing this herself." Another voice, older, dry, answered, "Poor thing." Victor heard both. He enjoyed them. He glanced at the 3 attorneys seated beside him, all in tailored navy suits, all with leather portfolios arranged just so. One of them leaned in, murmuring something under his breath. Victor did not need to hear it, to know what it was. He had paid a lot of money to make sure this day unfolded exactly like this. Across the aisle, Helen felt the room before she heard it. The weight of judgment, the quiet appraisal. People counting the years on her face, the lines at the corners of her eyes, the lack of confidence they assumed must live behind them. To most of them, she looked like what they expected her to be. A woman in her late 50s who had made one bad decision too many and finally lost. The bailiff called the court to order. Chairs scraped. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Helen rose last, not because she was slow, but because she waited until the room settled, until the noise dropped, until the attention unwilling as it was found her again. Judge Raymond Sullivan took his seat and scanned the courtroom with a practiced calm. He had seen men like Victor Hale before. He had seen women like Helen Carter, too. Usually, they did not come alone. "Case number 2, 784, the clerk announced. Carter versus Hale. Petition for dissolution of marriage and division of assets." Victor's lead attorney stood smoothly, buttoning his jacket. "Jonathan Pierce for the respondent, Your Honor." The judge nodded. His eyes moved to Helen and the petitioner. Helen cleared her throat. The sound was small, but it carried. "Helen Carter, representing myself." A ripple moved through the room. Not surprise. Amusement. Victor's smile widened. He crossed his arms, settling back as if settling in for a show. Judge Sullivan studied her for a long moment. "Ms. Carter, you understand you have the right to counsel. This case involves substantial assets and complex financial structures. I understand, Your Honor, and you are choosing to proceed without an attorney." "Yes, sir." The judge hesitated, then nodded once. "Very well." Victor watched her face closely, waiting for a crack, waiting for nerves, waiting for regret. What he saw instead unsettled him just slightly. Not fear, not confusion, Focus, Pierce launched into the opening statement with confidence that bordered on boredom. He spoke of Victor Hale as a self-made executive founder and chief executive officer of a private logistics technology firm valued at several $100 million. He spoke of long hours personal risk innovation. He spoke of a marriage that had run its course, of a wife who had enjoyed the benefits of success without bearing its burdens. Helen listened without moving. Her eyes did not drop. Her jaw did not tighten. Only her fingers shifted once against the edge of the folder. Pierce concluded with a familiar refrain. My client is prepared to offer a fair settlement. Generous given the circumstances. What is being sought here goes beyond fairness. It seeks to rewrite history. Victor nodded, as if on cue. Judge Sullivan turned. Ms. Carter. The room leaned forward without realizing it. Helen stepped away from the table. No notes, no prepared speech, just her voice, steady but low. Your Honor, she began, I won't argue valuation today. I won't argue percentages. Not yet. Victor's eyebrow lifted amused. I want to talk about erasure. A murmur moved through the gallery. Judge Sullivan's pen paused. For 23 years, Helen continued, I worked in rooms where my name stopped being said out loud. Meetings where decisions were made after I left. Contracts that used my ideas, but not my signature. That wasn't my marriage failing. That was something else. Pierce shifted in his seat. Victor's smile thinned. Helen turned her head slightly, not looking at Victor, but past him. Toward the attorneys. Toward the people who thought they already understood this case. You'll hear a lot about what I didn't do, she said. About what I wasn't. What I lacked. But before we get there, I need this court to understand something. She held up the manila folder. The paper trembled once, then stilled. I am not here because I was left behind. I am here because something was taken. The words landed harder than she expected. Even she felt it. Victor's foot tapped once against the floor. He did not notice himself doing it. Judge Sullivan leaned back, studying her. Ms. Carter, you'll have the opportunity to present evidence. For now, please confine yourself to an opening statement. Helen nodded. Of course. She took a breath. The kind you take before stepping into cold water. This case is not about a divorce, she said. It's about a system that assumes silence means absence, and a man who relied on that assumption. Victor's jaw tightened. Just enough. Helen returned to her table and sat. The room exhaled. Judge Sullivan called for a brief recess before proceeding. Chairs shifted. Low voices filled the space. Victor stood, straightening his jacket. He leaned toward Pierce, his voice controlled but sharp. She's trying to make this emotional. Pierce nodded. It won't matter. Victor glanced across the room. Helen was alone again, head bent slightly, eyes closed for just a moment. He felt it then. Not fear. Not yet. Something else. The uneasy sense that the woman everyone had already dismissed had walked into the room knowing something they did not. And whatever it was, she had not come here to beg for it back. The recess ended too quickly for Victor's liking. He preferred momentum when it was on his side, and momentum had shifted in a way he did not fully understand. When the judge returned, the air felt tighter. The gallery had filled with a few more bodies, drawn by nothing more than instinct. People sensed when something quiet was about to turn. Judge Sullivan adjusted his glasses. "We'll proceed with preliminary matters. Ms. Carter, you may call your first witness when ready." Helen did not stand right away. She opened the folder in front of her with deliberate care, smoothing the crease as if it mattered. Her movements were unhurried, almost ritualistic. The kind of calm that unsettles people who expect panic. "I call Thomas Green," she said. A man in his early 60s rose from the second row of the gallery. He wore a brown blazer that had seen years of use and a tie knotted slightly off-center. His hair was more grey than brown, now his posture stiff from old injuries that never healed quite right. He hesitated for half a beat before walking forward, eyes flicking briefly toward Victor, then away. Victor stiffened. The name landed wrong. Green took the oath and sat. His hands rested on the rail in front of him. Fingers interlaced, knuckles pale. Helen approached the stand, stopping just short of arm's length. She did not smile. She did not soften her voice. "Mr. Green, how long did you work with Victor Hale?" Green swallowed. 15 years. From the beginning. And your role, Chief Operations Officer. Before that, logistics planning. Victor leaned forward slightly. Pierce shifted beside him, pen already moving. Helen nodded once. In those early years, when the company was still operating out of a shared warehouse in New Jersey, who approved vendor contracts. Green glanced at the judge, then back to Helen. Both of them did. Both of who? Victor and Helen. A quiet intake of breath rippled through the room. Pierce was on his feet. "Objection. Relevance." Judge Sullivan raised a hand. "Overruled. Answer stands." Victor's foot stopped tapping. Helen continued her tone, even. "Miss Green, do you recall a compliance audit in the fall of 2016? Green nodded slowly. "I do." "What was the issue?" Green hesitated, jaw tightening. "We were flagged for irregular routing data. It looked like manipulation. And who identified the source?" Green exhaled. "Helen did." Victor's eyes narrowed. This was not how this was supposed to go. What would have happened, Helen asked, if that audit had gone unresolved? The company would have lost its federal contracts, possibly faced criminal charges. Helen took one step back, letting the weight of that hang. But it didn't. "No," Green said quietly. "Because she fixed it." Pierce stood again, sharper now. "Your Honor, this testimony goes beyond the scope of marital asset division." Judge Sullivan leaned forward. "Mr. Pierce, I'm interested in understanding the operational realities behind the assets in question. Sit down." Victor did not look at Pierce. His gaze stayed locked on Helen, searching for the misstep that never came. Helen shifted her angle slightly, allowing the jury box empty, but symbolic to frame her. "Mr. Green, after that audit, were there changes to how decisions were documented?" "Yes." "Whose name stopped appearing on official reports?" Green closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. Hers. Victor's breath came out slow through his nose. The room felt suddenly too warm. Helen nodded, as if confirming something she had already known. No further questions. Pierce moved fast, eager to regain ground. "Mr. Green, You were terminated from the company 2 years ago, correct? Yes. For cause? Green's jaw tightened. That's what they said. And you're currently involved in litigation against Mr. Hale. Yeah. Pierce smiled thinly. So you have a motive. Green looked at Victor, then really looked at him, and something old and heavy passed between them. I have a conscience, Pierce snapped. No further questions. Green stepped down, shoulders hunched, as if relieved and ashamed all at once. Helen returned to her table. She did not look back at him. Judge Sullivan made a note. His pen moved slowly. Victor leaned toward Pierce, voice low. You said she had nothing. Pierce did not answer right away. Helen stood again. Your Honor, I'd like to submit preliminary exhibits. She handed documents to the bailiff. The sound of paper passing hands seemed louder than it should have been. These documents, Helen said, are not about ownership. They're about access. Victor's fingers curled against the armrest. Judge Sullivan scanned the first page, then the second. His brow furrowed. Pierce stood. We have not reviewed these. You had access to them, Helen said calmly. They were in the shared archive until the day I was locked out. That did it. Victor stood abruptly. This is ridiculous. Judge Sullivan's voice cut through the room. Mr. Hale, sit down. Victor froze, then complied, his face flushing. Helen did not look at him. She addressed the judge. Your Honor, these records show internal permissions. Who could authorize data transfers? Who could sign off on restructuring? Who could move assets without triggering review? Judge Sullivan looked up slowly. And who was that Helen's voice did not waver? Me. Silence fell like a dropped curtain. Pierce opened his mouth, then closed it. He turned pages too quickly, the sound betraying him. Judge Sullivan removed his glasses. Ms. Carter, are you alleging misconduct beyond this court's jurisdiction? Helen met his eyes. I'm saying this court deserves the full picture before deciding what is fair. Victor's pulse thundered in his ears. This was no longer a narrative he controlled. Judge Sullivan leaned back, studying Victor now. Not as a litigant, as a man. We'll adjourn for the day, the judge said, finally. I want time to review these materials. Both parties will return tomorrow. The gavel struck. People rose slowly, voices low and urgent. Victor remained seated, staring at the table as if something had slipped beneath it, and he could still reach it if he tried. Helen gathered her folder, sliding the papers back into place. Her hands trembled now, just slightly, the cost of holding herself together, finally demanding payment. As she turned to leave, Victor stood blocking her path. You think you're clever, he said under his breath. You think this ends well for you. Helen looked at him then. Really looked. This already ended, she said quietly. You just didn't notice. She walked past him without another word. From the back of the gallery, a man in a dark coat watched her go. His expression unreadable. He did not clap. He did not speak. He simply nodded once as if confirming something long suspected. Victor did not see him, but he would. The courthouse emptied in waves, but Victor Hale stayed where he was, long after the hallway noise thinned to echoes. He watched Helen's reflection fade in the glass of the exit doors, then forced himself to breathe. He had survived audits, hostile takeovers, boardroom ambushes. This was theatre. He told himself that until the words lost meaning. Outside, Helen paused on the steps, the cold biting through her coat. The city hummed with late afternoon traffic horns and sirens threading together. She stood still, eyes closed, counting breaths the way she had learned years ago, when panic used to take her without warning. 4 in, 6 out. Again. She opened her eyes to see the man in the dark coat standing a few feet away, hat pulled low, posture easy but alert. "Ms. Carter," he said, voice even. A word. She did not flinch. "If you're press, I have nothing to say." He smiled faintly. "I'm not press." He handed her a card. No logo, just a name and a number. Daniel Mercer. She studied it, then him. 60, maybe older. Lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested patience rather than age. "I'm not hiring anyone. I'm not offering services." He nodded toward the doors behind her. "You changed the temperature in that room. People notice that." She folded the card into her pocket. "People notice lots of things. It doesn't mean they understand them." "True," he said. "It does mean they start asking questions." She turned to leave. He did not follow. Inside the building, Victor finally stood. Pierce caught up with him, breath quick. "We can contain this." Victor's jaw worked. "You told me she was irrelevant." "She was invisible," Pierce said. "That's not the same thing." Victor stopped walking. "Fix it." Pierce hesitated. "We need to slow this down." "Delay. Challenge admissibility." Victor leaned in, voice low and dangerous. "I don't do delay. I do control." That night, Helen sat alone in her apartment, a small place overlooking a brick wall that held the day's heat like a memory. She spread the documents across her kitchen table, aligning corners, checking tabs. Her phone buzzed once. Unknown number. She let it ring. It buzzed again. She answered. "Helen." "Daniel Mercer," the voice said. "I don't like leaving things hanging. I told you I'm not hiring anyone." "I know," a pause. "I wanted to warn you." Her fingers tightened around the phone. "About what?" "Victor doesn't lose quietly." She smiled without humor. "Neither do I." Another pause, longer this time. "Then be careful how loud you make this." She ended the call and sat back, staring at the ceiling until the hum of the refrigerator filled her head. The next morning, the courtroom felt different. Not louder, sharper. Victor arrived early, his legal team already in place, papers arranged like fortifications. He nodded to no one. His gaze tracked Helen as she entered measuring. She wore the same coat, the same watch, but there was something else now. A steadiness that had not been there before. Judge Sullivan took the bench. "Ms. Carter, you may proceed." Helen rose. "Your Honor, before I call my next witness, I'd like to request the court take judicial notice of a restructuring that occurred 3 years ago within Hale Systems." Pierce was on his feet instantly. "Objection. That restructuring is proprietary and unrelated." Helen did not look at him. "It's related to authority." Judge Sullivan gestured. "Proceed." Helen turned slightly, addressing the room. 3 years ago, Hale Systems created a subsidiary to manage routing algorithms. quietly. No press, no board announcement. Victor's eyes flicked to Pierce. Pierce's pen stopped moving. I approved the framework, Helen continued. I wrote the governance rules, including a fail-safe. Pierce snapped speculation. Judge Sullivan said Ms. Carter. Helen nodded. I call Margaret Lynn. A woman in her early 70s approached the stand, white hair cut short, glasses perched low on her nose. She wore a navy cardigan and sensible shoes. She moved with the confidence of someone who had testified before and would do it again if needed. Ms. Lynn, Helen said gently, "Could you explain your role at Hale Systems?" Lynn adjusted the microphone. I was head of internal risk assessment, retired last year, and when the subsidiary was formed who held override authority, Lynn did not hesitate. Helen did. Pierce's objection collided with Judge Sullivan's gavel. Order. Victor's breath caught. This was wrong. This was not how the structure worked anymore. Helen's voice remained calm. Ms. Lynn. When did that offer change? Lynn glanced at Victor. It didn't. A murmur rose. Judge Sullivan leaned forward. Explain. Lynn folded her hands. The override required dual authorization to remove. It was never completed. Pierce's face drained of color. That's impossible. Lynn met his gaze. I signed off on compliance. You didn't ask. Helen let the silence stretch. Then she spoke, each word precise. Your Honor, that authority governs data integrity across all subsidiaries. Judge Sullivan sat back, eyes narrowing. Mr. Hale. Victor stood a fraction too quickly. This is a misunderstanding. Helen turned to him finally. Is it? The room held its breath. Judge Sullivan said, Ms. Carter, are you saying you still have operational access? Helen nodded once. I'm saying I never lost it. Victor felt the floor tilt. Control. He had assumed control. Judge Sullivan's voice was careful now. Ms. Carter, if that's true, this court needs immediate clarification. Helen reached into her folder and removed a single sheet. She held it up. This is a live status report, generated this morning. Time stamped. Pierce lunged forward, then stopped himself. Victor's hands curled into fists. Judge Sullivan read, then looked up. This indicates a lock pending. Helen met his eyes. I requested a freeze, as allowed, until the court determines rightful authority. The room erupted, voices layered. Judge Sullivan struck the gavel repeatedly. Order. Order. Victor's vision tunneled. You can't do this. Helen's voice cut through the noise, low and unwavering. I already did. Judge Sullivan stood. This court will take a recess. Mr. Hale, you will remain available. Ms. Carter, do not alter any systems without court approval. Helen inclined her head. Understood. As the courtroom broke apart, Victor stood frozen, the world moving without him. Pierce grabbed his arm. We need to negotiate, now. Victor shook him off. His eyes tracked Helen as she gathered her papers. In the hallway, Daniel Mercer stepped into her path again, this time closer. You just pulled the emergency brake. Helen exhaled slowly. I pulled what was mine. Mercer studied her, something like respect crossing his face. They'll come hard. She nodded. They always do. He glanced back toward the courtroom. When they do call me. She met his gaze, then walked past him into the light. Victor watched from the doorway, his reflection fractured in the glass. For the first time in decades, he did not know what move came next. And that terrified him. By nightfall, the freeze had done what freezes always did. It stopped the noise long enough for fear to find its way in. Victor Hale sat alone in his office, the lights of the city bleeding through floor-to-ceiling windows, his phone vibrating every few minutes on the desk. Board members, legal counsel, 2 regional directors who never called after hours unless something had gone badly wrong. He let it ring. Control, he reminded himself, came from choosing when to speak. Across town, Helen Carter sat at her kitchen table again. The same documents spread out, but the room felt different now. Tighter, as if the walls themselves were listening. She could still feel the courtroom in her bones, the moment the judge's eyes had shifted, the moment Victor's certainty had cracked. It had cost her more than she expected. Her shoulders ached. Her hands shook when she poured a glass of water. The knock at the door came softly, almost polite. She froze, glass halfway to her mouth. No one knocked softly unless they did not want attention. Another knock. Same rhythm. Helen set the glass down and moved toward the door, every step measured. She did not ask who it was. She opened it. Daniel Mercer stood in the hallway, coat unbuttoned, hat in his hand. His eyes flicked past her into the apartment, then back. "I told you to call," he said. "And I told you I wasn't hiring anyone." He nodded once. "You're not." "Not yet." She stepped aside. He entered, closing the door behind him. The apartment smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner. Mercer took it in without comment. "They filed an emergency motion," he said, "arguing you acted in bad faith." Helen leaned against the counter. "Of course they did. They're also moving assets offshore." Quietly. Or trying to. Her head snapped up. "They can't." "They shouldn't," Mercer corrected. "But they are." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, anger and something like grief twisting together in her chest. "I warned the court." "You did." Mercer studied her. "Which is why this matters." She straightened. "You said you weren't offering services." "I'm offering information," he said. "There's a difference." He pulled a thin folder from his coat and set it on the table. Inside were names, shell companies, dates. Helen's breath caught. "How did you get this?" "I ask questions for a living." She looked up sharply. "For who?" He met her gaze, steady. "For systems that break when people think no one's watching." She absorbed that, then nodded slowly. "What do you want?" Mercer's mouth curved faintly. "To see what you do next." The following morning, the courtroom buzzed before the judge even took the bench. Reporters lined the back wall, now notebooks out, eyes sharp. Victor arrived late, jaw set, his legal team huddled around him like a shield. He did not look at Helen. Judge Sullivan wasted no time. "We'll address the emergency motion first." Pierce stood voice-clipped, rehearsed. He spoke of abuse of authority, of unilateral action, of reckless interference. He painted Helen as vindictive, unstable a woman, weaponizing access she no longer deserved. Helen listened without expression. When it was her turn, she rose slowly. "Your Honor," she said, "this is not about revenge. It's about preventing harm." Pierce scoffed audibly. Helen turned eyes sharp. "Mr. Pierce, you said this restructuring was proprietary, confidential, but you never said it was compliant." Judge Sullivan raised a brow. "Ms. Carter." Helen reached into her folder and withdrew another document. "This is a risk memo dated 6 months ago, flagging unauthorized asset movement." Victor's head lifted. That memo was resolved. Helen met his gaze. No, it was ignored. Judge Sullivan took the paper, reading in silence. The room held its breath again. "Mr. Hale," the judge said finally, "did you authorize these transfers?" Victor stood. "On advice of counsel." Pierce stiffened. "Which counsel?" Judge Sullivan asked. Victor hesitated. Just long enough. Helen's voice cut in. "The counsel not present." Pierce spun. "Objection." Judge Sullivan waved it away. "Overruled." Victor's face flushed anger, bleeding through control. "This is a fishing expedition." Helen's voice dropped quiet, but carrying. "Then why are you afraid of the net?" The words hit harder than she intended. Victor opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands trembled. Judge Sullivan leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, this court is concerned." Silence. Until this matter is resolved, the judge continued. The freeze remains. Any attempt to circumvent it will be viewed as contempt. Victor nodded stiffly. Understood. Helen sat, heart pounding, her vision blurring at the edges. She forced herself to breathe. Slow in, slower out. During the break, Victor cornered Pierce near the benches. "You said this was contained." Pierce's voice dropped. "She's not playing the game you expected." Victor's eyes burned. "Then change the game." Helen stepped into the hallway and nearly collided with Margaret Lynn. The older woman caught her arm, steadying her. "You okay?" Lynn asked softly. Helen nodded. "I didn't expect to see you again." Lynn smiled sadly. "You didn't expect a lot of things." She leaned closer. "Be careful. They're not used to being challenged by someone they thought they erased." Helen met her eyes. Neither was I. As the day dragged on, motions piled up. Objections, sidebars. Victor's confidence frayed at the edges, his composure slipping in small, telling ways. A raised voice, a clenched jaw. The gallery noticed. So did the cameras. By late afternoon, Judge Sullivan called for adjournment. "We'll reconvene tomorrow. I expect cooperation." Victor left without looking back. Helen gathered her papers, exhaustion washing over her now that the adrenaline faded. Mercer waited near the exit again, as if he had always belonged there. "They're running out of room," he said quietly. "They still have money," Helen replied. He nodded. "Money runs out faster when people start asking who it belongs to." She stepped into the fading light outside the courthouse, the sky bruised purple and gold. For the first time in years, she felt the ground beneath her feet shift not away from her, but toward her. Somewhere behind her, Victor Hale paused at the top of the steps, watching her go. The city swallowing the certainty he once wore like armor. Helen did not look back. The calls started before dawn. Victor Hale woke to the vibration of his phone skittering across the nightstand, the screen lighting the ceiling in pale blue pulses. He did not answer the first one, or the second. By the third, he was already sitting up, heart hammering the silence of his penthouse, suddenly too loud. Victor came the voice when he answered, tight and clipped. "We have a problem." Victor swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Be specific. The credit committee suspended review. Not permanently, but long enough to make people nervous." Victor closed his eyes. They don't do that all without a reason. They're citing governance uncertainty. Victor ended the call without another word. Across town, Helen Carter stood at her kitchen sink, watching the sky lighten through the narrow window above it. She had not slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the courtroom again. Victor's face when the judge ruled. The moment his certainty cracked. It was a dangerous thing, knowing you could hurt someone who had spent years convincing you that you were powerless. Her phone buzzed. Daniel Mercer. "They're leaking," he said without greeting. She took a breath. What kind of leak? Controlled. Whisper campaigns. Painting you as unstable. Saying the freeze was an emotional stunt. Helen's jaw tightened. "Let them." Mercer paused. "That confidence will cost you if you don't back it up." "I intend to." The courthouse buzzed with energy when Helen arrived that morning. More cameras, more spectators. The story had legs now, a woman who had been erased stepping back into the frame. People loved that narrative. Victor hated it. He sat rigid at the defense table, eyes fixed ahead, his legal team murmuring around him. The freeze had done more than stall transactions. It had forced questions. Questions from investors, from regulators, from people Victor had trained never to doubt him. Judge Sullivan took the bench, his expression grave. "We'll continue with evidentiary matters." Helen rose. "Your Honor, I call Victor Hale." The room went still. Victor's head snapped toward her. Pierce leaned in, urgently whispering. Victor shook him off and stood, straightening his jacket with mechanical precision. He walked to the stand as if the floor were solid, as if the world had not shifted beneath him. He was sworn in. He smiled faintly at the judge. "Good morning." Helen approached, stopping just short of the rail. She did not rush. She let the silence do the work. "Mr. Hale, she said you testified earlier that operational authority was transferred away from me." "Yes." "And you believed that transfer was complete?" "Yes." Helen nodded. "Then you won't mind explaining why the authority still exists." Pierce was on his feet. "Objection," asked and answered. Judge Sullivan shook his head. "Overruled." Victor's smile tightened. It was an oversight. Helen tilted her head. An oversight that survived multiple audits. Victor's fingers curled against the armrest. Mistakes happen. Helen took one step closer. "Do they happen selectively?" Victor's eyes flicked to Pierce. Pierce stared at his notes. Helen continued. "Let's talk about the offshore entities." Victor stiffened. "Those are legal." "Legal does not mean transparent," Helen said. "Who authorized their creation?" "I did." "And who was listed as a contingent beneficiary?" Victor hesitated. The room felt like it leaned in. Helen's voice sharpened. "Answer the question." Victor swallowed. She was. Helen let the word hang. Was. Judge Sullivan's pen paused mid-air. Helen moved, circling slightly, changing the angle of the room. "When was my name removed?" Victor's jaw clenched. "I don't recall." "You signed the amendment," Helen said, sliding a document toward him. Time stamped. "You initialed the margin." Victor stared at the paper as if it had betrayed him. "On advice of counsel." Again Helen said softly, "Which counsel?" Pierce stood. "Your Honor, Judge Sullivan cut him off. Sit down, Mr. Pierce." Victor's breath came shallow now. It was a precaution. Helen's voice dropped, steady and lethal. "Precaution against what?" Victor said nothing. Helen straightened. "Against me." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Helen pressed on. "You began restructuring assets before filing for divorce. You reduced my visibility, limited my access, removed my name where you thought no one would notice." Victor's eyes burned. "You're making this personal." "It was always personal," Helen said. "You just benefited from pretending it wasn't." Judge Sullivan leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, answer the questions." Victor's control fractured. "I built that company." Helen's voice did not rise. "You built it with me." Victor laughed once, sharp and humorless. "You kept schedules. You balanced books. That's not building." The words hit the room like a slap. Helen did not flinch. "Then why did you hide it?" Victor froze. Helen held his gaze. "If my contributions were so small, why erase them?" Silence. Judge Sullivan watched Victor carefully. "Mr. Hale." Victor's shoulders sagged just a fraction. "Because perception matters." Helen nodded slowly. "There it is." She stepped back. No further questions. Victor remained on the stand, breathing hard, the armor gone. When Judge Sullivan dismissed him, he returned to his seat without meeting anyone's eyes. During the lunch recess, Helen sat alone at her table, hands folded, staring at nothing. The adrenaline was gone now, replaced by a hollow ache. This was the part she had not prepared for. The cost of saying the truth out loud. Daniel Mercer appeared beside her unannounced. "You forced him into the light?" She nodded. "And now?" "Now the system reacts." He handed her a folded printout. Regulatory inquiry opened. Informal. For now. Her breath caught. Because of the freeze. Because of the questions. She closed her eyes. "I didn't want this to be about punishment." Mercer's voice softened. "It rarely is. It's about balance." The afternoon session dragged motions and objections, stacking like bricks. Victor's team fought to regain footing, but the room had changed. The judge's patience wore thin. The gallery watched Victor differently now, not as a titan, as a man scrambling to hold a story together. As court adjourned, Victor stood alone for a moment, staring at the empty bench. Pierce approached cautiously. "We should talk settlement." Victor's laugh was brittle. "She wants more than money." Pierce hesitated. "She wants acknowledgement." Victor's face hardened. "She'll never get it." Outside, Helen stepped into the cooling air, the sky dimming toward evening. She felt wrung out, stripped bare, but standing. Mercer walked beside her in silence for a few steps. "They're bleeding," he said finally. Slowly. Helen looked up at the darkening sky. So did I. She stopped on the courthouse steps, turning back once just enough to see Victor emerge, smaller than she remembered, his shoulders hunched against the night. Their eyes met across the distance. There was no triumph in her gaze, only clarity. Victor looked away first. Helen descended the steps, the city rising to meet her, unaware that the story everyone thought they knew was no longer the one being told. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It crept in through side doors Victor Hale had forgotten existed. By mid-morning, his calendar dissolved into cancellations. A breakfast briefing moved, then vanished. A board call postponed indefinitely. His assistant stood in the doorway of his office, tablet clutched tight. Her face carefully blank, in the way people learn when they sense proximity to a fall. "They want assurances," she said. Victor did not look up from the window. "From who?" She hesitated. "From you." He dismissed her with a wave and stayed where he was, staring down at the city that had once looked like proof. He had built his life on momentum, on the belief that if he moved fast enough, the ground would rearrange itself beneath him. Now the ground was still, waiting. Across town, Helen Carter sat in a small conference room that smelled faintly of old carpet and burnt coffee. The courthouse had loaned it to her for the afternoon, a neutral space away from cameras. Papers lay spread across the table, not neatly this time. There were gaps, unknowns, places where instinct had carried her further than certainty. Daniel Mercer stood by the window, arms crossed. "You understand what you've triggered?" Helen nodded. "I understand what he's trying to hide." "That's not the same thing." She met his gaze. "It never is." He exhaled slowly. Victor's leverage wasn't just money. It was silence. "You broke that." Helen leaned back in her chair. Silence was never neutral. Mercer studied her, something unreadable flickering across his face. "They're circling." She almost smiled. "So am I." The next hearing began without ceremony. No gasps, no drama. Just the steady grind of consequence. Judge Sullivan listened as filings were entered, as dates were set, as the case widened beyond the neat boundaries Victor had once relied on. Words like inquiry and oversight floated through the room, calm and lethal. Victor sat rigid, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed ahead. He did not look at Helen. Not once. When the judge adjourned for the day, Victor stood abruptly brushing past Pierce without a word. In the hallway, his phone rang again. This time he answered. "Yes," he snapped. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, polite, measured. "Mr. Hale. This is Special Agent Karen Morales." Victor's stomach dropped. "I have counsel." "You're welcome to have them present," Morales said. "This is a courtesy call." "About what?" "About ensuring records remain intact." Victor closed his eyes. "You're overreaching. We'll let the facts decide that." The line went dead. Helen watched from a distance as Victor paced the hallway, phone still in his hand. She felt no satisfaction, only a strange, hollow quiet. This was the part people never talked about. The moment when power shifted and no one knew where it would land. That evening, she returned to her apartment and found the door slightly ajar. Her heart slammed. She froze, listening. Silence. Too perfect. She pushed the door open slowly. The lights were on. Nothing looked disturbed. No drawers pulled. No obvious signs of intrusion. On her kitchen table sat a single envelope. No name. No return address. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a flash drive and a note written in careful block letters. You deserve to know the whole story. Helen sank into a chair, the weight of the day finally pressing down on her. She stared at the drive for a long moment before plugging it into her laptop. The files opened one by one. Emails, internal memos, conversations she had never been copied on, plans discussed in rooms she had not been invited into. The deeper she went, the colder she felt. Victor had not just erased her. He had positioned her, used her reputation for stability as cover, while risky decisions were made elsewhere. When things went wrong, she would have been the name attached. The quiet partner, the invisible one. Her phone buzzed. Mercer. You get anything interesting tonight? He asked. She swallowed. Someone wants to confess without being seen. He was silent for a beat. Send me copies. I'm not sure I trust you yet. A pause. That's wise. The next day, the courtroom felt heavy, as if it knew what was coming. Helen did not bring the flash drive out right away. She waited, watched, listened. Victor's legal team argued technicalities, jurisdiction, timing, procedure. They spoke as if precision could still save them. Judge Sullivan listened, then turned to Helen. Ms. Carter. She stood. Your Honor, I have new evidence. Pierce sprang up. We object. Judge Sullivan raised a hand. On what grounds? Pierce faltered. We haven't reviewed it. You will, the judge said calmly. Proceed. Helen's voice was steady, but inside she felt like glass. These documents show decisions made without board approval. Risks concealed. Liability shifted. Victor stared at her, now disbelief cracking his composure. Where did you get those? She met his gaze. From the system you thought you controlled? The judge's eyes hardened. Mr. Hale, did you authorize these actions? Victor stood his movements sharp. This is theft. Helen shook her head. It's disclosure. The room buzzed. Judge Sullivan leaned forward. Mr. Hale, answer the question. Victor's shoulders sagged. For a moment, he looked older, smaller. I did what I had to do. Helen's voice cut through quiet but relentless. You did what you thought you could get away with. The judge called a recess. The room erupted into whispers. Cameras flashed in the hallway. Helen stood still, bracing herself against the table. Mercer appeared at her side again. You just changed the scope. She nodded. I know. He studied her. You ready for what that means? She thought of the flash drive, the note, the years she had swallowed her voice to keep things running smoothly. I've been ready longer than I realized. Across the room, Victor watched her. Something like fear finally surfacing beneath the anger. For the first time, he understood what she had been doing from the beginning. She had not been trying to win. She had been telling the truth in a system that had never expected her to speak. And now it was listening, The truth did not explode. It spread. By the next morning, Victor Hale's name was no longer spoken with certainty. It was spoken carefully. Phones rang and were not answered. Meetings ended early. People who once leaned in now leaned away, their bodies angled toward exits they had never needed before. Helen Carter felt it before she saw it. The subtle shift in how the courtroom staff looked at her. The way the bailiff held the door a second longer. Respect did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, like gravity reasserting its pull. Judge Sullivan opened the session without preamble. His voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it now. This court has reviewed the supplemental materials submitted overnight. Victor sat rigid, his hands folded too tightly, the skin around his knuckles pale. Pierce leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Victor did not respond. "Ms. Carter, the judge said you may proceed." Helen stood. The room felt smaller today, the walls closer, the air denser. She held no papers this time. She did not need them. "Your Honor," she said, "I want to be clear about my intent." Victor looked up sharply. "I did not bring these materials forward to punish Mr. Hale. I brought them forward because they explain why so many decisions never made sense to me, why questions were discouraged, why my role kept shrinking even as my responsibilities grew." Pierce rose. "Your Honor, this is narrative." Judge Sullivan did not look at him. "Sit down." Helen continued, her voice calm, precise. "These documents show a pattern. Risk shifted downward. Accountability moved sideways. And silence rewarded." She turned slightly, addressing the room. "This is not about one man. It's about what happens when systems are built to listen only to certain voices." Victor's jaw worked. His control was slipping thread by thread. Helen finished. "I am asking this court to consider not just what was taken from me, but what was hidden from everyone." Judge Sullivan nodded once. "Thank you, Ms. Carter." He turned to Victor. "Mr. Hale, you may respond." Victor stood slowly. He looked smaller now, the tailored suit no longer armor, but costume. "Your Honor," he began, "this has become a spectacle." Helen did not react. "I built a company that employs thousands. I took risks. I made hard choices. I did not always communicate perfectly, but nothing I did was malicious." Judge Sullivan's gaze was unwavering. "Intent is not the only measure, Mr. Hale." Victor's voice sharpened. "Ms. Carter is framing herself as a victim because it's convenient." Helen's eyes lifted cold and clear. Victor pressed on, desperation creeping in. She had access. She benefited. She was not powerless. Helen spoke before the judge could stop her. "Access without voice is not power." The words landed hard. Judge Sullivan held up a hand. "Enough." Silence fell. "Mr. Hale, the judge, said this court is not persuaded by arguments of convenience. What concerns me is consistency and transparency." Victor's shoulders sagged just slightly. "We will proceed with forensic review." The judge continued. "Independent. Court appointed." Pierce's face drained. "Your Honor." "This is not optional," Judge Sullivan said. "Any obstruction will be viewed accordingly." Victor sat down hard, the fight draining from his posture. During the break, Helen stepped into the quiet of the side corridor, her heart pounding. She pressed her palm to the cool stone wall, grounding herself. This was the edge. She could feel it, the place where stories either collapsed or transformed. Daniel Mercer appeared beside her as he always did now, like a shadow that chose its moments. "You see it?" She nodded. "They're not controlling the narrative anymore." "No," he said. "Now they're reacting to it." She turned to him. "You still haven't told me who you really work for." He smiled faintly. "I told you. Systems." "That's not an answer. It's the only one that matters." Across the hallway, Victor stood alone, his phone pressed to his ear. "I need you to stop this," he hissed. "No, I don't care how. Make it go away." He listened. His face went slack. "What do you mean they declined?" Silence. He lowered the phone slowly, his hand trembling. For the first time, there was no one left to call who could fix this. Helen watched him from a distance, something tight loosening in her chest. Not triumph, recognition. This was what accountability looked like. Messy, uncomfortable, unavoidable. When court resumed, Judge Sullivan addressed the room again. "Until the forensic review is complete, this court will maintain all existing restrictions." He paused, eyes flicking briefly to Helen. "Ms. Carter, you will be included in all proceedings moving forward." Included. The word settled over her like a benediction she had not known she was waiting for. Victor's head snapped up. "That's inappropriate." Judge Sullivan's gaze was sharp. "What's inappropriate is exclusion." The gallery murmured. Reporters scribbled. Helen remained still, her face composed, but inside something cracked open. For years she had been managing damage in the dark. Now the light was on, and it was not hers to carry alone anymore. As the session ended, people moved differently around her, slower, more careful. She gathered her things, feeling the weight of the days ahead, the cost that had yet to be paid. Outside, the sky hung low and grey. Mercer walked beside her down the steps. "You're past the point of no return," he said. She nodded. "I passed that a long time ago." He studied her. "Most people would have settled." She stopped, turning to face him. "Most people never get asked who they are when they stop being useful." Mercer's expression softened. "You're going to change how this ends." Helen looked out at the street, at the ordinary life moving past the courthouse. "I'm not trying to change the ending," she said. "I'm trying to tell it correctly." Behind them, Victor Hale exited the building, flanked by attorneys who no longer spoke with confidence. He paused at the top of the steps, watching Helen walk away, her back straight, her pace unhurried. For the first time since he had met her, he saw her clearly, not as support, not as background, as the one person who had finally refused to disappear. And the story, no longer his to control, moved forward without him. The waiting was worse than the confrontation. Days passed without headlines, without court appearances, without the sharp release of motion and response. The forensic review moved in silence, the kind that swallowed sound and gave nothing back. Helen Carter learned how loud quiet could be. Every morning, she woke before the alarm, heart already braced, listening for the phone that did not ring. Victor Hale filled that silence differently. He tried to outrun it. He took meetings no one requested. He sent emails that went unanswered. He walked the length of his office again and again, the city below him unchanged, indifferent. The freeze remained. The inquiry widened. His name began to surface in places it had never belonged. Compliance briefings, internal memos, risk assessments, stamped confidential but no longer safe. On the 5th day, his assistant stood in the doorway again, eyes lowered. "The board wants to speak with you." "When?" "Now." The boardroom smelled of stale coffee and tension. Faces he had known for decades would not meet his eyes. The chair cleared his throat. "We've been advised to consider interim leadership." Victor laughed, sharp and brittle. "You're overreacting." No one laughed with him. Across town, Helen sat in a windowless office, lent to her by the court, reviewing a summary she had read 3 times already. The forensic team had begun to outline patterns, not conclusions. Patterns. That was how accountability entered the room. Not with accusations, but with math. Daniel Mercer leaned against the file cabinet, arms crossed. "They're going to try to isolate this." She did not look up. They always do. "They'll frame it as a few bad calls, a misunderstanding." Helen traced a line on the page with her finger. "This is not misunderstanding. This is design." Mercer nodded. "You're ready to say that out loud?" She looked up, then meeting his gaze. "I already have." The next hearing was scheduled quietly. No cameras this time. No gallery packed with spectators. Just the judge, the attorneys, the weight of what had been found so far. Judge Sullivan entered, his expression unreadable. "We'll proceed." The lead forensic examiner spoke first, her voice calm, precise. She did not look at Victor when she outlined the discrepancies. She did not need to. Numbers did the work. Timelines intersected. Permissions overlapped where they should not have. Risk was shifted. Responsibility obscured. Victor sat still. Hands folded, his face a careful mask. He had spent his life controlling rooms with confidence. Now the room did not need him. Helen listened, her spine straight, her breath steady. She felt each confirmation like a stone placed gently but firmly in her hands. Not victory. Wait. When the examiner finished, Judge Sullivan turned to Victor. "Mr. Hale." Victor stood. His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it now. "I dispute the interpretation." Judge Sullivan inclined his head. "You may submit rebuttal." Victor glanced at Pierce. Pierce looked tired, older. Helen felt the shift then, the subtle but unmistakable moment when resistance stopped being strategy and became reflex. The judge dismissed the session early. "We'll reconvene after further review." In the hallway, Victor caught up to Helen for the first time in days. He did not block her path. He walked beside her, his voice low. "You could stop this." She did not slow. "It's not mine to stop." "You want acknowledgement," he said. "I'll give it to you." She stopped, then turning to face him fully. "You don't get to negotiate truth." His jaw tightened. "You think this ends with you winning. I think this ends with it being honest." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You don't understand what you're burning." She met his eyes. "I understand exactly what I was burned by." They stood there, the space between them heavy with years that could not be rewritten. Then Victor stepped back, shaking his head. "You were always like this. Quiet. Persistent." Helen's voice was steady. "You mistook that for small." He walked away without answering. That night, Helen returned to her apartment and sat in the dark, the city's glow leaking through the blinds. The adrenaline had faded. The certainty remained. She poured a glass of water and let it sit untouched. The silence pressed in again, but it no longer felt like threat. It felt like space. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number she did not recognize. "Thank you for not letting this disappear." She stared at the message for a long moment, then set the phone down. The following morning, the call finally came. Daniel Mercer's voice was quieter than usual. "They're preparing findings." Helen closed her eyes. "When?" "Soon." She exhaled slowly. "And Victor." Mercer paused. "He's not in control anymore." Helen opened her eyes, the weight of the words settling. Control. It had always been the illusion that mattered most. When the court reconvened, Judge Sullivan did not waste time. He spoke carefully, deliberately. "This review has raised significant concerns." Victor stood, but the judge held up a hand. "You will have opportunity to respond." "Not today." The judge turned to Helen. "Ms. Carter, the court recognizes the role you played in bringing these matters to light." The words were measured, formal, but they carried something else too. Respect. Victor stared at the bench, his face unreadable. As the session ended, Helen gathered her papers, feeling the tremor in her hands at last. Mercer walked beside her out into the afternoon light. "You did what most people don't," he said. "You stayed." She looked at the courthouse behind them. "I stayed because leaving was killing me." He nodded. "What happens now?" She thought of the years ahead, the quiet rebuilding, the identity no longer defined by proximity to someone else's power. "Now," she said, "we let it finish." Behind them, Victor Hale remained inside, seated alone in a room that no longer bent to his will. The story he had written for decades had moved beyond him, no longer asking permission. And Helen Carter, once erased, walked forward into a future that would have to make room for her, whether it wanted to or not. The decision did not arrive with drama. It arrived with paperwork. Helen Carter sat at the narrow table in the courthouse annex, the same place she had waited through so many hours of not knowing and listened as Judge Sullivan read from the findings. His voice was even controlled, the way voices become when the weight of meaning no longer needs embellishment. The forensic review was complete. The patterns were confirmed. Authority had been manipulated, risk deliberately displaced, assets repositioned in anticipation of personal advantage. Not as a mistake, not as confusion, as strategy. Victor Hale stood while the judge spoke, hands clasped behind his back. Posture rigid, eyes fixed on a point just above the bench. He did not interrupt. He did not argue. He seemed to understand that the moment for performance had passed. Judge Sullivan finished and looked up. "This court finds that Ms. Carter was systematically excluded from decision-making while retaining liability exposure and that material actions were taken to obscure that fact. Helen felt the words settle into her chest. Not relief, not triumph, recognition. Victor exhaled slow and controlled, as if he could still manage how the loss entered his body. The judge continued. As a result, the freeze will remain in effect pending final disposition. Further, the court will refer these findings to appropriate oversight bodies. Victor's jaw tightened. He nodded once. The judge's gaze shifted to Helen. Ms. Carter, you have the right to respond. She stood slowly. Her legs felt heavy, as if the room were thicker than air. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady. I don't have anything to add to the findings. A murmur moved through the room. I asked this court to look at what happened. She continued. You did. Judge Sullivan studied her. Very well. The gavel struck. The sound was dull, final. Outside the courtroom, the hallway buzzed with restrained urgency. Lawyers whispered. Staff moved quickly. No cameras, no microphones. Just the quiet machinery of consequence doing its work. Victor stood alone near the wall, his phone in his hand, the screen dark. Pierce approached cautiously. We should discuss next steps. Victor did not look at him. There are no next steps. Pierce hesitated. There are always next steps. Victor finally turned his eyes, tired, stripped of calculation. Not for me. Pierce faltered, then nodded, retreating as if unsure where to stand now that gravity had shifted. Helen watched from a distance. She did not approach Victor. She did not need to. The story between them had reached its end, not with shouting, but with exposure. Daniel Mercer joined her, his presence familiar now. They'll formalize the referrals within days. She nodded. I know. You okay? She considered the question carefully. I think so. He studied her face. That's not a small answer. She exhaled. For a long time, I thought winning meant being seen as right. Now I think it just means being seen. Mercer's mouth curved slightly. That's usually how it works. They stepped outside together. The afternoon sun was pale, filtered through clouds that looked as if they might break but never did. Helen stood on the steps, letting the air fill her lungs, the courthouse rising behind her like something she had climbed rather than escaped. Across the plaza, Victor emerged alone. No attorneys flanking him now. No aides, just a man in a dark coat walking toward a waiting car. For a moment he stopped and looked back. Their eyes met across the distance. There was no anger in his gaze, no apology either, just the quiet recognition that something fundamental had been taken from him. Not money, not control, the ability to pretend. Victor turned away and entered the car. The door closed softly. The vehicle pulled into traffic and disappeared. Helen watched until it was gone. Then she let her shoulders drop just a little. Later that evening, she sat at her kitchen table, the same table that had held so many documents, so much doubt. The papers were gone now, stacked neatly in a box by the door. The laptop was closed. The silence felt different tonight, not oppressive, earned. Her phone buzzed with a message from Margaret Lynn. You did the right thing. Another from Thomas Green. Thank you for not letting them bury it. She set the phone down and poured herself a glass of water. She raised it slightly, not in celebration, but in acknowledgement, to endurance, to truth told without permission. When she went to bed that night, Sleep came without argument. In another part of the city, Victor Hale sat alone in a dim hotel room, the penthouse already surrendered to the board. He stared at the wall, replaying moments that now carried different weight. Decisions made too quickly, warnings dismissed, silence mistaken for loyalty. For the first time, he understood what Helen had meant when she said it was never about revenge. It was about seeing the whole picture. He lay back on the bed and closed his eyes not to rest, but to escape the clarity that had finally found him. Helen woke the next morning to light through the window and a sense of space she had not felt in years. The future was still uncertain. There were hearings ahead, settlements, rebuilding. But the hardest part was over. The story that had once been written around her had been interrupted, corrected, and whatever came next, it would not happen without her name attached. The first thing Helen Carter did after the ruling became final was nothing at all. No interviews, no statements, no victory laps. She stayed home for 3 days, letting the silence finish what the courtroom had started. The apartment still looked the same narrow hallway, the same window that caught the late afternoon light just right. But the air had changed. It no longer felt borrowed. On the 4th morning, she packed a single box. Not documents, not evidence. Personal things she had left untouched for years because they belonged to a version of herself that had been on hold. Old notebooks, a framed photo she had once turned face down, a watch Victor had given her early in the marriage, now stopped its hands frozen at a time that no longer mattered. She placed the box in the trunk of her car and drove without urgency. The city moved around her ordinary and indifferent. That felt right. Justice, she had learned, rarely arrived with fireworks. It arrived with quiet permission to move forward. Across town, Victor Hale signed his name for the last time in a context that had once defined him. The board had accepted his resignation, not as punishment, as necessity. He did not argue. There was nothing left to argue with. The story he had relied on no longer held. He left the building carrying less than he had arrived with years ago. No entourage, no urgency, just the weight of consequences that could not be negotiated away. In the parking garage, he paused beside his car and looked up at the concrete ceiling as if expecting it to say something. It did not. Helen did not think about him much anymore, not out of forgiveness, out of clarity. He had moved from presence to chapter. That was all. 2 weeks later, she walked into a modest office space on the east side of the city. Nothing flashy. Clean walls, big windows, a single conference table waiting to be used. The sign on the door read, Carter Advisory Services. Smaller letters beneath it. Governance, risk, accountability. Margaret Lynn arrived first, carrying coffee and a smile that held relief more than celebration. Thomas Green followed, hands in his pockets, posture easier than it had been in years. Others came quietly. Former colleagues, people who had watched the system work against them and stayed silent because they thought silence was survival. Helen stood at the head of the table listening more than she spoke. This was not a comeback. It was a continuation. The work she had always done, now visible. Daniel Mercer watched from the doorway, as he often did. He did not stay long. He never did. Before leaving, he paused beside her. "You're building something that won't need hiding?" She nodded. That was the point. He smiled once, then disappeared into the city. Weeks passed. The world adjusted. News cycles moved on. Other scandals took their place. But the quiet ripples remained. Policies changed. Oversight tightened. Names once whispered were spoken plainly. Helen received emails from people she had never met. Short messages. Simple ones. "I saw what you did. Thank you." One afternoon, she stood alone in her office as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the floor. She thought of the woman who had walked into a courtroom alone, underestimated, already dismissed. She felt tenderness for her, and respect. Helen locked the door and stepped outside. The street was busy, alive. She blended into it easily now, no longer carrying the weight of being unseen. Stories like hers rarely make headlines for long. They do not fit neatly into outrage or triumph. They live in the quieter places, in the spaces where systems change because someone refused to disappear. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of the cost of silence and the power of truth spoken steadily, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comment. Tell your story.